Pokemon is one of those franchises practically every single person has some form of attachment to. Whether that's with the games, the animated series, the trading cards, you name it. We all have so many fond memories with the series, like picking our first Pokemon, beating the Elite Four, and being bullied in high school for enjoying the series. No? Just me? Oh, well, that's sad. Yes, Pokemon for decades now has dominated pop culture. But despite all of this, in the eyes of myself and many others, Pokemon is kinda dead. Now, I can already hear you typing a very angry comment and accidentally hitting the subscribe button in the process. But allow me to explain myself, and maybe you'll understand where I'm coming from. Pokemon, of course, is far from actually dead commercially. The games still sell millions of copies. It has many fans across the globe, and is still the highest grossing franchise in history. But what is dead is the soul of Pokemon. In the last few years, with each game released, it really does just feel like these games are not the same anymore. The heart isn't there, and the games haven't got the soul that made us all so attached in the first place. Is this because we've grown up now? Partially. But I believe there was a turning point that changed the franchise forever and set it down the path of becoming a former shell of itself. So in this video, I'll be telling you all the day that, at least for me, Pokemon died. I don't think many people can argue that most of the Pokemon games in the mainline series are timeless masterpieces, even from the earliest generations starting with 1 and 2. These were some of the most influential and revolutionary games ever made, though far before my time, considering, you know, I am not a boomer. I may be young status, but I'm not a boomer. There's no denying that these games set the stage for the series perfectly, and gave birth to the most profitable franchise of all time, catching monsters, forcing them to battle, making Peter angry. Its unique ideas and fresh spin on the turn-based RPG formula was something we had never really seen before, as well as delivering on some absolutely fire remakes of their respective games later on down the years. Although I missed out on the original games, I can safely say I played the hell out of Fire Red and loved every second of it. Following on from this, we had Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald that only pushed the boundaries further for the franchise. And then after this, we had Generation 4, which was truly a turning point, giving us peak games like Diamond, Pearl, and one of the best in the series, Platinum. A lot of people share the opinion that Generation 4 was the best, and it's really hard to argue with this sentiment. These games had improved the formula to an almost perfect level. From the gameplay, to the art, to the music, to the eldritch horror. Generation 4 was truly an amazing time to be a Pokemon fan. And then we had Generation 5. Oh, you thought I was gonna say that this was the start of the downfall, didn't you? Yeah, fat chance! Because in my eyes, Black and White is where Pokemon absolutely peaked as a franchise. For a while, this may have been a very controversial statement, and it probably still is. After all, for a long time, Generation 5 received a lot of undeserved hate, becoming a rather controversial entry into the series. But over the years, I think many people have come to realize how amazing these games were. The main complaints being that this generation's Pokemon designs were terrible, two key outliers being the trash and ice cream Pokemon that were used as scapegoats for this point, which I never thought was fair because, you know, every single generation has their own questionable designs as well. Visually speaking, this is the best Pokemon has and sadly may ever look. Back in the older entries, while the sprites look good, they were all rather static. Pokemon and trainers sliding in and out of battle, resulting in a rather boring experience that has no flair. Of course, this was due to limited technology, but the point still stands. With Gen 5, we were blessed with glorious 2D sprites that had full animation. They were bouncy, dynamic, and most importantly, full of life. No longer am I watching two PNGs duke it out, but rather these are now living and breathing creatures. Stuck in a loop. Okay, it isn't perfect. Even besides that, the gameplay was solid, the music was full of absolute bangers, and the Pokemon designs, while a hot topic, were not bad by any means. Some of my all-time favorite Pokemon are in this generation. Even to this day, Oshawott is my favorite starter Pokemon. I mean, just look at this little guy. How can you disagree? But the main thing that impacted me the most was the story, specifically that of the character N. I don't know exactly what it was about N or the story of Black and White that resonated with me so much. His backstory, his unique ideals, or just the fact he was so different to any rival or antagonist we had faced before. It's not even just him. The game was full of vibrant and lovable characters characters just as much as any other generation. It was the most emotional Pokemon had ever been, and for that I loved it immensely. I will admit I carry some bias, seeing as this was the newest generation out when I first got into the series. But regardless, this entry of the franchise is still to this day my favorite. You may be wondering why I've talked about Gen 5 for such an extended period of time. That's because in my eyes, this is where the series peaked. And when something peaks, what follows is the inevitable decline, leading me to the day that Pokemon died, which was the 12th of October 2013, aka the release of Pokemon X and Y. This wasn't because the games were bad, but because this release would go on to change Pokemon forever. X and Y were the most hyped Pokemon games in the entire series. For the first time ever, the game would be making the leap into 3D, not counting the spin-off games of course. It was an exciting time to be a fan of the series. So when the game finally released onto the 3DS, the game was, well, it wasn't all that. But that doesn't mean it was bad. After all, I really enjoyed this entry back when it was first released. It had fun gameplay, decent Pokemon entries, the interesting concept of Mega Evolutions, and it even has a rather touching story, just like Black and White did. Overall, the transition to 3D initially was a great success. At least it was for the 3DS. A lot of the problems X and Y faced could simply be put down to the limited hardware of the 3DS. They stylized it the best that they could, but it was obviously never going to be perfect. Even with its fair share of faults, I could still happily play the game. So, now there were a few mainline games down into this new era of 3D Pokemon, going from handheld consoles to more powerful handheld consoles, the games that we have been receiving still to this day still look visually disgusting. The Switch obviously doesn't have the reputation of being a very powerful console, but when we compare the newest Pokemon games to other games such as the Zelda games, Mario Odyssey, and Xenoblade Chronicles, with it being very possible for Switch games to look great, how can Pokemon games still look this bad? I mean, what excuse is there for one of the biggest franchises ever to still look like this? Because I promise you, they definitely have the budget. It just feels embarrassing for a franchise of this scale, this profit, this legacy. Why they feel the need to cheap out and cut corners to an embarrassing level is honestly astounding. Long gone are the days of charming 2D pixel art, because since the jump to 3D, it's only gone worse as new games have been released when the quality should be going up. Now obviously graphics aren't everything. Even if a game looks absolutely terrible, I could still end up enjoying it with no issues. But there's an even bigger problem that's happening. Pokemon itself is becoming rather stagnant. Sure, there's the age-old mantra of if something isn't broken, then don't fix it. But when things have been stagnant for this many years, I don't know, shaking things up wouldn't be so bad. Pokemon's inherent problem is that they are afraid of change. From the old games on the Game Boy to the modern iterations on the Switch, the core gameplay of Pokemon has barely changed. The only new additions are gimmicks that do very little to change things drastically. Because I promise you, no one cares to see Pokemon appeal to someone's inflation fetish. It almost feels like every person who's interested in Pokemon are craving a game that Gamefreak sort of refuses to make. I'm talking about the game every kid dreamed about. A fully open world Pokemon game where these creatures roam free. You travel through stunning lands, catch Pokemon, and battle trainers as you overcome with a huge sense of adventure. Being able to interact with Pokemon in ways we haven't really perceived before. Essentially, people want Breath of the Wild meets Pokemon, which I totally get. After all, every game these days is already a Breath of the Wild clone, so the more the merrier. But to Game Freak's credit, they did actually try to deliver on this, with the release of Pokemon Legends of Arceus. Legends of Arceus contains a lot of things fans of the series have been asking for years. An open world where you explore the map and search for Pokemon that roam in the wild, giving you a sense of exploration and wonder that more linear Pokemon entries with very planned ways to travel have always lacked in. You have full choice in how you approach the wild Pokemon you may encounter, and with the nature of the game, you choose yourself where you'd like to go first. The combat has been shaken up, the game's focus has changed, it was, if nothing else, at least very different. And while this was a very valiant attempt at experimentation, this, as usual for Game Freak, missed the mark as well. The problem with this entry lies with a lack of a full commitment to any of these ideas. I mean, for starters, this isn't even truly an open world game. Merely 5 zones connected to each other lazily that you have have to travel between like levels, breaking any sort of immersion you could build while exploring. Granted, these areas may be quite large, but as a consequence, they just feel rather empty. The landscape feels hollow and lacks any real notable locations such as gyms or even dungeons. All you pretty much do is catch Pokemon, which I get is the point of the game, but it still makes everything feel a little pointless to me. On top of all this, as per usual, the game is still really ugly. This would be fine if the art design was on point, but even that was lackluster. And with the game not even being a mainline game in the series, it was hard for us to get excited about this. The lack of effort and corners cut when it comes to so many aspects is just frankly unacceptable. It never felt like a full game and rather a tech demo for Pokemon's potential masterpiece of a game. It was so close to that dream game that every Pokemon fan has wanted forever. But sadly, with the sales not being up to par with the recent Switch titles they've been releasing, Nintendo and Game Freak probably won't see any value in continuing to expand on these ideas much further. Although with the upcoming Z2A game, perhaps they will. We'll just have to wait and see. When we saw how close we came to greatness just for a lack of effort and not risking an idea like this on a mainline game to ruin it, it was understandably super frustrating. After all, this was probably the most controversial Pokemon game that has ever been released in the franchise. Some say it was good, some say it was bad. Either way, this new entry and a chance to change up Pokemon forever didn't quite meet standards. And so, modern Pokemon has been the same ever since, with nothing to take the franchise further or in a brand new direction. You might say that I'm just guessing that Pokemon fans want something new, and maybe you'd be right. That is, if it wasn't for one small team of developers who proved that it is possible to create the Pokemon game fans want. Palworld was released only this year, and within a week of the game's launch on Steam, it managed to peak at over 2.1 million concurrent players. To put that into perspective, that puts the game just under PUBG for the all-time record on Steam. Though the game has had a massive fall-off, with these numbers being drastically down now, for a solid month or two, Palworld was all anyone was talking about. It was trending. It had controversy. It was everywhere. So hearing this magnitude of success, you must think the game was amazing. A total 10 out of 10 brilliant game that would go on to change the landscape of gaming forever and kill Pokemon once and for all. Well, I'm sad to say that this was far from the case. Truth be told, I don't even think Palworld was ever that great of a game. Don't get me wrong, the game was okay. I initially went into this game expected to hate the absolute hell out of it. It looked like a cheap asset flip, it seemed uninspired, and honestly, just pretty boring. And after playing it, okay, yeah, most of that is true, but it wasn't all bad, and it did have some interesting mechanics that at least intrigued me. Still, with my opinion of the game, I always thought it was very grossly overrated. Why was this rather mid-game doing stupidly well? And it's because even if the game was fairly subpar, it didn't matter, because clearly Palworld had something that recent Pokemon games have been lacking for a while now. Palworld is more or less as close as we have gotten to our dream Pokemon game, albeit with far more OSHA violations. It had a bigger focus on open world exploration, which already takes this concept far further. The map design isn't anything to put on a pedestal, but unlike Legends of Arceus, it feels like there's purpose in the world, and a reason for you to explore outside of just catching pals. There's towers which contain boss fights, the Rain Syndicate camps that you can take on, you can farm for resources, and there's even these huge overworld bosses that remind me a bit of WoW raid bosses. Already there are a lot more objectives, which makes the things you're doing a lot more meaningful, but I think Palworld proves that a lot of players are desperate for a change to the Pokemon formula. The addition of survival elements took the concept of a creature collector to places Nintendo and Game Freak would never dare to go. You do more than just capturing creatures and battling with them. You grind for new items, create entire farms where slave labor is not only mandatory but encouraged, and shoot innocent creatures. Okay, yeah, this game is pretty edgy, and I'm not saying Pokemon should do this. Honestly, Palworld isn't even wholly similar to Pokemon. As a matter of fact, I'd compare it more to games such as Ark or even Rust, and these were apparently their main inspiration more so than Pokemon was. And although it's as far away from your traditional Pokemon game in gameplay and tone as you can get, players loved it because even if it wasn't that great, at the least, it was something different. But I guess with their player numbers dropping, Nintendo and Game Freak really had nothing to ever worry about. Oh my god, are you actually serious? Yes, it seems Nintendo just couldn't take the L on this one, as they are now suing Pocket Pair, the developers of Palworld, due to various breaches of patents they own. It's not exactly clear what patents they're being sued for yet, but people have speculated it's this one specifically talking about catching monsters with spherical objects. Patents are not a new concept within the gaming industry, and generally speaking, I am not a huge fan of them. When interesting gaming mechanics get created and then get stuck behind a patent, this stops any other developers from taking a cool concept and expanding upon it to make it even better. We saw this with the Nemesis system in Shadow of Mordor, where enemies remember you and your past encounters. This is a really cool system, but because they put a patent on it, now no other game can ever use this system. It's greedy, it's scummy, and it does nothing but harm the industry as we know it. So Pokemon suing over these various patents because there were no legal grounds for a standard copyright dispute is just sad. Clearly they're upset they actually have a competitor after pushing out mid-slop for the past 10 years or so. And now that they have some actual form of rival, instead of trying to improve their games to beat them fair and square, they simply just go to shut them down instead. Forget what I said earlier. X and Y weren't the day the Pokemon died at all, because the 19th of September 2024 is when Gamefreak and Nintendo truly crossed the line and proved they don't want to innovate or change Pokemon, and would rather dominate alone with their modern, lackluster iterations. Because of this event, I doubt anything to do with Pokemon will ever garner my respect ever again. Which is sad, because I truly think they could shift the tide and get closer to making the dream game I've been talking about. In fact, it does seem like Pokemon are getting closer with the announcement of Pokemon Legends Z2A, a continuation from Arceus that could either serve to improve everything that made the first edition in the series rather poor, or just continue on with the same mistakes because they still refuse to put any effort into their games. I'm gonna bet on the latter. Either way, this is still not a mainline game, and chances are with them more interested in suing rather than improving, it's likely that the soul of Pokemon will remain dead. I mean, with the last two Switch games in the series being some of the best-selling Pokemon games ever, I doubt they will be encouraged at all to improve things. Hopefully the Switch 2 can at least make these games look more impressive, because that would be at least a step in the right direction. I truly did love Pokemon, and a part of me always will, but unless things change, I doubt I ever will again.